Hi everyone, I wanted to show you guys this interesting study that I came across today. So the tech had labeled the study as a bicuspid aortic valve. So I want to go through things that we look for when we are looking at a bicuspid aortic valve. Here's a close-up of the valve, looking pretty stenotic. And what really is interesting is when we start looking, here's the LVOT. This will become relevant later on, the LVOT size. So when we typically look at aortic regurgitation, we look at a few things. One of them is a vena contracta, which is the narrowest neck of the measure of the narrowest neck of the regurgitant just as it comes through the aortic valve. When you have a bicuspid aortic valve in a very eccentric jet of regurgitation, very often you don't get that very nice vena contracta. And that's the reason that is that you are getting regurgitation along the entire seam of closure in the aortic regurgitation. And just to tell you guys what I mean by an eccentric seam of closure, so here is the tricuspid aortic valve, a normal looking aortic valve. So when an aortic valve is closed, and if it's leaky, it's usually leaking right here in the central area. What happens is, well, a lot of times with a wear and tear of the aortic valve, the tips kind of start to calcify and curl away, so you end up with this nice central jet. So when you are looking at the aortic valve on the parasternal long axis view, the jet is nice and central. However, with a bicuspid aortic valve, the valves open like this. So if you can imagine this valve opening, the opening orifice is actually much narrower than the opening orifice of a normal tricuspid valve. So initially you're dealing with some hemodynamic problems, and as the valve wears and tears, it wears and tears along these seams. So if you were to have regurgitation, rather than having a nice regurgitation right here smack in the middle of the aortic valve, now you're dealing with regurgitation along the entire seams. It just doesn't make sense to judge a aortic regurgitation jet in a bicuspid valve with something like a vena contracta. So really what you need to do is a volumetric method, which I'll show you guys a little bit later. So our tech has very nicely shown you the aortic regurgitation jet on FOSS here in the parasternal short axis view. This is the image before, so you can place where you are. Parasternal short axis view, the RVOT here, pulmonary valve here. We're now completely honed in and zoomed in on the aortic valve. So here's the 5-chamber view. You can see that the aortic regurgitation jet is splayed along the LVOT. Here's the LVOT, the aorta, the ventricle, the right ventricle, and the left atrium. So here's the issue. So I'm going to just go ahead and show you my measurements. So we are getting LVOT VTIs in the 25, 26 range, which is fine and good. That's indicative of a normal stroke volume. However, when you do have severe aortic regurgitation, you actually expect that the LVOT VTI would be much higher than it is here. I would have expected numbers in the 30s, maybe even 40s. This is actually pretty low for someone with aortic regurgitation, which is one of the reasons why I question whether or not there was severe aortic regurgitation. One of the reasons this may be is that we had placed a pulse Doppler a little bit too far into the ventricle rather than the LVOT, but for all intents and purposes, this looks fairly good, and the tech keeps getting pretty consistent numbers in the 20s and really nothing too high. And also now looking at the aortic CW across the aortic valve, you're getting numbers of 400. Now we also have a mean gradient of 39.7. So until I find a better way to do this, I thought we could all do the aortic valve area together. So the aortic valve area is the LVOT area multiplied by the LVOT VTI, and that whole thing divided by the aortic valve VTI. So, valve VTI. So now let's crunch these numbers together. There's two ways to get a regurgitant volume for aortic regurgitation. There is using the ERO method or using PISA to calculate an ERO, which is essentially impossible because of the way that the regurgitation jet looks. The other way is to use this volumetric method, which I will attempt to do, and you will see with very problematic results here. So just to remind you guys, what is the regurgitant volume? The regurgitant volume is the total stroke volume, which is the stroke volume outside the aortic valve, which you guys remember is the LVOT area multiplied by the LVOT VTI, subtracted from the stroke volume coming through the mitral valve. So that would be the regurgitant fraction. An easy way to think about this is what I always say, which is what comes in must come out. So in diastole, what's coming in? Your regurgitant volume here and your stroke volume across the mitral valve. So both are coming in. The same amount must come out, and that's going to be your stroke volume across the aortic valve. So if you were to rearrange this formula, it would be RV down here plus SV here equals stroke volume across the aortic valve. See, what is the one time that we can't do this? Third years, I hope you've said the right answer. It is when you have more than mild mitral regurgitation, because then you will have two things going out, and you cannot solve an equation if there's two variables. So this is from the Journal of American Society of Echo, the official document on valvular regurgitation lesions, just reminding you that you should be measuring the mitral annulus and mid-diastole here in the apical 4-chamber view, and early systole for the LVOT measurement. You should be measuring the VTI across the mitral valve at the level of the mitral annulus, not at the tips. That is purely for diastolic function, so at the mitral annulus. And you're going to be measuring PW of the aortic valve, LVOT outflow at either your 5-chamber or, if needed, your 3-chamber views. So I'll be showing you guys the numbers I use, and I'm not going to torture you guys with the calculations here, but I'm just going to show you what I use, and you can do the calculations yourself. The mitral annulus measured at mid-diastole, I got about 30 millimeters or 3 centimeters. The LVOT VTI, we're going to use 26 as before. The LVOT diameter is 1.9 as we used before. Now the real problem is getting the PW, for the mitral valve inflow. So ideally we would like to get it at the mitral valve annulus, which do here. However, I don't think the tech had intended to really get the stroke volume across the mitral valve, which is fair because it's not something that we always do. But if we were dedicated to doing volumetric analysis of this mitral valve, we would hone in, we would decrease our baseline a little bit, so this waveform is a little bit put our baseline down a little bit, and maybe decrease our scale so that we just get a bigger jet to measure. So I kind of scrambled and measured these two jets. I got 12 and 16, so I used 16. So mitral valve VTI 16, mitral valve annulus 29 millimeters or about 3 centimeters rather. LVOT VTI 26 centimeters, and LVOT diameter 1.9. So I'll tell you the numbers that I got. For stroke volume across the mitral valve, as I got 112, and the LVOT outflow was 76. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because we're seeing the stroke volume out the LVOT, which is the 76, subtracted by the mitral inflow, which in this case is 112, should give us a regurgitant volume, which now would be negative. So these numbers don't quite make sense, and there's a few places where we could have made an error. One is measuring the LVOT, which I think in this case is actually measured very well, but I think the big source of error is measuring the mitral inflow. which is we didn't really set out to do it here, so I think we could have done a better job. Again, the tech did a wonderful job even doing this, but I don't think she was prepared to do a mitral inflow. But just a thought for next time when there's aortic regurgitation, maybe do a pulse Doppler here at the mitral valve annulus, a more dedicated one with nicer, bigger envelopes, so that we can do a volumetric assessment and measuring the mitral valve, mitral annulus, which is always problematic. So in this case I got 30, but maybe it's higher, maybe it's lower, it's really hard to tell. And there's always a huge problem in measuring the mitral annulus because we're assuming that the mitral annulus here is circular, and you guys know it's not. It's actually saddle shaped. So using this measurement as a substitute for mitral valve annulus is really problematic. So when in the aortic regurgitation, this case is just like so cool. So in an aortic regurgitation case, a bicuspid aortic case, you always have to look for a coarctation. So now here is the suprasternal notch view, looking at the descending aorta here, and whoa, lo and behold, look at these velocities are upwards of 2. I got 200. You can't really see the scale here, but it is about, let's drag it over, 200s to 300s, which just tells you that you gotta be thinking of a coarctation. In this case here, I looked at the history. The patient actually has a coarctation that has been repaired, so that's why these velocities are elevated, but not probably as elevated as they were. So I hope that helps. This is a great study, so thank you to the tech who did this. She did a wonderful job. So, but just hopefully I'll give you guys some food for thought for next time.